there's frictions, okay? You know, we think about market failures, missing markets, externalities, you know, informational agency problems, you know. And what I've noticed is that economists have come to think of politics as being something like that, something like a friction, something like, you know, something that gets in the way. You know, we have a social planning problem, we calculate the efficient allocation of resources. Things get in the way, external get in the way, frictions get in the way, and politics gets in the way. Okay, so what I want to try to convince you in the next half hour is I think that's probably completely the wrong way to think about politics. It's a little bit of the right way, but mostly it's the wrong way. And in particular, you shouldn't think about a social planning problem with politics as a kind of constraint. Now, there's really papers about that, you know, including not by myself, but by my distinguished co-authors. You know, politics becomes a constraint on the social planning problem. And that is really not the way to think about politics, okay? So, you know, we've come to think of politics as something that gets in the way of reforms and better policy, you know, as was just suggested. So let me start with a useful diagram which organizes a lot of thinking, you know, say who gets in the way, who gets in the way. So here's a beautiful diagram, you know, from Everett Rogers' old book on the diffusion of innovations. It's a fantastic book if you've never read it. And he kind of sort of says, like, you know, he's looking at the introduction of a new innovation and who accepts it and who rejects it. But, you know, that's a bit like policy reform. No, it's a bit like a new institutional reform. It's a bit like, you know, so he sort of says, there's a distribution of people, you know. There's the people who, of course, who are innovators on the left, okay? Then there's early adopters. There's people who've drunk the Kool-Aid. There's people, you know, who've been to AERC meetings and they know, yeah, that's the right thing to do. We need to do that, you know. Then there's the early majority kind of people who sort of get with the plan. The late majority, skeptics, and, you know, and then there's the laggards. The laggards, people who are just like, over my dead body. We're never going to do that here, you know. So there's resistance. And this resistance can be motivated by lots of different things. It could be motivated by the distributional effects of policy. It could be motivated by ideological differences. It could be motivated by all sorts of things, you know, which I'll try to talk about along the way. But I'm going to try to organize different examples according to this picture. So I think it's good to keep that picture in the back of your mind, okay, about there's this distribution and how do we get these people in this distribution to go along with a new change, a new policy, that's politics. That's what politics is. Politics is about getting the majority. It's about convincing the early majority. It's about persuading the laggards. And sometimes it's about stopping the laggards getting in the way. But think of it about as in terms of this distribution. Okay, so who's in the way? Okay, well, the laggards. Okay, I mentioned the laggards. All right, you could think the laggards are in the way. The laggards are kind of stopping change. That, you know, that's and the laggards have political power and they use that to kind of impede progress. Well, let me talk about a well-documented example that I've done research on, which is the politics of agricultural productivity in early modern and modern Britain. So in 1700, you know, large parts of Britain looked like this, okay? So this is Barton-on-Humber, a kind of unprepossessing, you know, municipality, you probably parish, we call it in England, that you've never heard of. But in 1700, it had an open field system. So there was the West Field, the South Field, the East Field. Land was divided into these three open fields where individuals had lots of little strips kind of divided up, and there were commons. At the bottom there was the common wold, and up by the River Humber there was the ings and cow pasture and horse pasture, common land that people could collect firewood from and turf and put their animals to graze on. Okay, so that's what Barton-on-Humber looked like. Now, you could enclose that land. Enclosure meant dividing up all the land into contiguous separate farms, taking the common land, dividing it between the people. And there was a well-defined process for enclosing in Britain in 1700, but it involved unanimity, meaning everyone had to agree, okay? And that stopped a lot of enclosures happening because there's always laggards, you know, there's always holdups. So what happened? Well, Parliament decided to intervene, okay? And Parliament created a process that moved Barton-on-Humber from the picture on the left to the picture on the right. So on the right, you can see what Barton Humber looked like after enclosure. Okay, you see the commons disappeared, the open fields disappeared, all the land has just been divided up, basically, between individuals in farms. Lots of other stuff going on there too, by the way. You can see there's a whole new system of roads was constructed. This was a moment of change. It created a fabulous opportunity for building new infrastructure also. So that was very important, okay? And the change from the left to the right had a huge positive impact on productivity. Like, how do I know? Well, I have estimates, you know. So we estimate that yields, for example, wheat yields or barley yields went up 50%, okay? Huge increase in productivity, okay? So why did you get stuck with the thing on the left, the picture on the left? You could say there were laggards. You needed unanimity. Now, lots of places did enclose, by the way, in Britain, despite the necessity of having unanimity, but Barton and Humber didn't, okay? So what did Parliament do, okay? It introduced a process. It said, okay, enclosure could move ahead by act of Parliament if the owners of 3/4 of the land agreed to it. So they created a process which stopped the laggards blocking, okay? Rid of the laggards, okay? Now, the laggards got their say. It was a very legalistic process. Parliament would appoint 3 commissioners. 3 commissioners went to Barton and Humber. They heard evidence. They talked about who used the commons, and they drew maps and whatever. And laggards could complain, and there was a process, and they could even go to the quarter sessions, these kind of courts, and complain. But there was a legal process that led to an act of Parliament. Barton enclosed. Okay, so. Yeah, did it have distributional effects? It did have distributional effects. Land inequality went up, and perhaps that's what the laggards were complaining about. But there was very little protest because it was such a kind of legalistic process. Okay, so there were few protests because it was so legalistic. So I'm going to advance what I'm going to call the reverse image. Okay, here the way I said this is there's a problem. There's a problem. The status quo has economic institutions, property rights, they're inefficient. You can move to something which is 50% more efficient. But getting there is a political process. It's politics that gets you from the inefficient to the efficient thing. Okay, that's what I'm going to call the reverse image. Okay, so think of politics as being something that gets you from the inefficient to the efficient thing. All right, that's the reverse image. Okay, so what about productive politics? Okay, so imagine, think of that, keep that diagram in your head. Imagine you're in a situation where you have to make decisions, you need to adopt a reform or build institutions, build a revenue service or whatever, okay? There's going to be early adopters, okay? There's going to be some people who are easily persuaded, okay? Takes you to 50%, okay? Minorities can cause problems and exercise veto power. That's what I was showing you in that very specific example, kind of the laggards, okay, like with the English enclosures. And also, and this, I'm coming to this, but this may be culturally specific. In lots of cultures, majority rule is not enough. Think Africa, okay? So you may want much more than that. And what I want to talk about today really is, once I've got that image in your head, I want to give you lots of examples of productive politics in action, political strategies that could move things forward, okay? Here's strategy number 1. This is, thanks to Abby put this thought in my mind, which is palaver with the laggards, meaning like in many African societies I'm familiar with, I've been working a lot in Eastern Nigeria in the last 6 years. If you go in a village in Eastern Nigeria, how are decisions made, like, the local council or whatever? By consensus, basically. Like, nobody votes on anything. You just keep deliberating until you all kind of agree that this is what we're going to do, okay? So, palaver with the laggards. Now, there's a great intellectual history of that, in Africa. So I thought I'd start by quoting Julius Nyerere. If you go back to what Nyerere wrote in the 1960s, it's kind of fabulous on this topic, Under the tribal system, whether there was a chief or not, African society was a society of equals, and it conducted its business by discussion. Leopold Senghor, in African socialism says, decisions of all kinds are deliberated in palaver, okay? So this idea of sort of deliberation and palavering and consensus, and maybe you don't agree, but you're all heard. Everyone's heard, and that's very important, to respect everyone's opinion. Everyone gets to voice, everyone to... So now that's a pretty unimaginable thing, I say, to an 18th century Englishman, but particularly to someone living in the United States of America at the moment. The idea of we get together and we kind of deliberate and we kind of reach a consensus decision. Now, of course, it's true, as Nereri says, this democracy, this totally unorganized talking until you agree, can no longer be adequate. It's too clumsy a way of conducting the affairs of a large modern state. But I think you can think of many of his ideas as, okay, how do we reinstitutionalize that in a modern, large modern state? And maybe he didn't succeed in doing that in Tanzania, but I don't think that's an agenda that has disappeared. I think we need a lot more ideas on how you institutionalize that in the affairs of a large modern state, to quote a Nereri. Okay, here's someone who managed to do it, by the way. You're thinking, oh no, what a kind of pie in the sky. What is Robert talking about? Well, here's a guy who did it, Seretse Khama. 1940, he's addressing the Hotla in Serowe. What's he doing? He's palavering, with the Ngwato, with the Bamangwato. That's how Botswana was built, by the way. If you go to the University of Botswana, you go in the front door, there's a cow, there's a peasant with a cow, a big cow, a statue. Why is there a peasant with a cow in the front of the University of Botswana? Because that's how the University of Botswana was founded. Because Seretse Khama asked everyone to bring forward a cow, and they raised $1.5 million through people donating cows, and that's how they founded the University of Botswana. Okay, so it is possible. It has. We can all think about what might be special or not in Botswana, but it needs to be reinstitutionalized. Yeah, but we need ideas to think about that. So that's the palaver with the laggards. That should be strategy number one. Okay, now strategy number two. This is kind of more conventional, you could say here, which is, if you have to have laggards, maybe you can minimize their numbers. Maybe the stress can avoid laggards. Some examples from British history, which I studied a lot. The Glorious Revolution in 1688. One of the things the Glorious Revolution did was create a modern fiscal system for the first time. Created the excise tax system, bureaucratized excise tax system. Now, who were the richest people in England in 1688? Aristocrats, big landowners. Wouldn't it have been better to tax them? Maybe, but they had the power, so you had to leave them alone, all right? So how did you leave them alone? Well, the excise tax system was bureaucratized. What did excise tax fall on? Excise taxes fell on things that poor people had, beer, butter, bread, But land taxes withered away in the 18th century. This is a very inelegantly scanned picture from John Brewer's book, The Sinews of Power. You can see the rise of the excise tax system. So this is the rise of excise tax revenues after the Glorious Revolution. And here's the land taxes withering away. Why were the land taxes withering away? Because the land tax system was never bureaucratized. There was, in fact, a kind of settlement that they were frozen at the county level. So why was it not bureaucratized? It was a way of committing to landowners, we're going to do this state building and institution building. We have to finance it, but we're not going to finance it at your expense. And we're going to commit to that by not bureaucratizing the land tax. Another great example, South Africa. Think about the transition in South Africa, okay? What did they do to all these white people, running institutions? They grandfathered them out. Here's some data on the ethnicity of South African judges after the transition. Okay, you can see the dark blue at the bottom is African. I couldn't find data for the entire span of time. I could only find 2010, 2017, but it makes a point. Okay, so the number of white judges is shrinking over time. The number of African judges is expanding over time. There was always about 10 colored judges, in the Western Cape, 10% Indian, but you grandfather the white judges retire, you replace them with black judges, with Africans, and you grandfather them out. This was part of the transition to keep white interests in place. Okay, we could discuss if that whole plan worked out well, but this part of it worked well. Okay, so Another great example, would be Chinese reform. Okay, a lot of Chinese economic reform took place basically on the margin that left state-owned industry untouched. It didn't threaten state-owned industry. It didn't do mass privatization. On the margin, it allowed the private sector to flourish. Okay, so here there was reforms which kind of respected and sort of left them alone as much as is possible. Okay, you couldn't palaver with the British aristocracy or the Afrikaners, so you could leave them alone. Okay, all right. And here's the dual track reform in China. This is from Ying Qian's great book on how China reformed, where he basically shows state employment even goes up in the 1980s. Private sector employment goes through the roof, go by 300%. Okay, so it's all on that margin where transition is happening. The incumbents are just left alone. All right, so that was strategy number 2. So one thing you could try to do also is put the laggards at ease. Okay, so there's a huge kind of non-convexity here, which I'll talk about. But you see in many instances of reforms, okay, the laggards, the potential laggards, let's pretend nothing is really happening. Okay, so like, think about the Glorious Revolution, back to the Glorious Revolution. If you look at the kind of Bill of Rights that was passed after the Glorious Revolution, all of the rhetoric is, this is not a revolution. Being horrified. Revolution? Are you kidding me? This is Britain. We don't have revolutions in Britain. That's a French thing. We're just re-establishing the hallowed rights of every single Englishman and woman. And there's no kind of Britain in 1688. Okay, so they were sort of pretending nothing is really happening. James II went into exile. He abdicated. There was a big debate about abdication, which you might think is like, oh, that's a kind of silly thing. No, it was very important to establish that he'd abdicated, because that showed that nothing had really happened, you see. He abdicated. He went off to France in a boat. He abdicated. So nothing is really happening. Think about Japan, the transition of Japan in the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration. Nothing's happening again, nothing new. It was actually a radical reconstruction of Japanese institutions, the building of a modern state, the expropriation of the samurai, like all sorts of stuff was happening. No, it's just a restoration. Nothing is really happening. This is just going back to kind of how Japan really used to be run. Confucius, if you read Confucius, he says the same thing. Like, there's nothing new here. I'm just going back to the Zhou kingdom, when Chinese institutions were kind of great, and, that's an interesting moment. So don't panic. There's nothing. Now, you could go to the opposite, which is, so that's not going to work. So maybe we need to switch to the opposite. Just really, there's just no way you can oppose it, right? It's a great example of that. Okay, back to South Africa. There's Mandela with his Springbok jersey on, the white sport. You can't oppose this. This is happening, and you all better get with the plan. So that's an alternative. That's an interesting. I don't have a model of that, but it's convexity. Like, you can't go in. You don't want to go in the middle. You go to one extreme or the other. Either nothing's happening, or so much is happening that you're just wasting your time trying to stop it. Okay. And I think, like, when you're doing that, when you're in this equilibrium here, like, doing something big and invisible is like really important. There's something so kind of symbolic about this. I'm not a big scholar of, like, semiotics. My friends here, in the University of Chicago talk about the semiotics, like the symbolism of things. But this is symbolic. This is not just about showing up at a sports event, right? This is very symbolic. So you want to do something very big, very visceral, if this is the route you're going to go down. Okay? A great example that I like, from my own personal experience, those of you who know me know, I spent many years working in Colombia and South America, and, I have family in Colombia. And 20 years ago, there was a fascinating transition in Colombia also, where a key role was played by this kind of very visceral element. So this is when I first went to Colombia in 1992. This is This is what used to happen. This is what they call in Colombia a pesca milagrosa, you know, a magical fishing. So magical fishing is like a euphemism for being like robbed or kidnapped basically on the road. This is a FARC, a kind of communist guerrilla, kind of basically, you know, shaking someone down on it's from a TV station, you know. So you couldn't drive anywhere because things were so secure. So when Alvaro Uribe became president, you know, he launched a strategy, he launched a military strategy, but he understood that it was going to take a long time for a military strategy to be successful because these guys were off in the mountains, in the jungles. They were where nobody was living. So it was very difficult to kind of show how to get people thinking that something new was happening. Well, here's the idea he came up with, okay? He put the army on the road, you know, with a Colombian flag with his thumb up. Now, I was in Colombia at the time when this happened, and people's first response to this was, this is madness. You know, these guys should be out in the jungle fighting these Marxist guerrillas. But like, what Uribe understood is, I have to show that things are changing, and I'm going to open the roads. Okay, I'm going to open all the roads, and that will get people back into public spaces, and that will have huge positive externalities. If you reclaim public spaces, like when I first went to Bogota, nobody went out at night. You just stayed at home. Okay? You didn't go out. So he got people to go out back in the streets, back in the restaurants, back in the cafes, drive. Like one of my friends, Alvaro Riascos, when this happened, drove from Bogota to Cartagena, like 1,000 kilometers for the weekend, just because he could. For the first time in 20 years, it was safe to drive to the coast. So it has these huge multiplier effects, okay? Very visceral. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was thinking, oh my gosh, you know, it's a new equilibrium, okay? And he hadn't defeated like one FARC unit at this point. Brilliant piece of political theater, okay? So to it, but which comes from a wonderful study of kind of productive politics, which is Robert Carr's book about Robert Moses. So Robert Moses was the kind of person who built New York City. I have a very inelegantly scanned map here for the second time in my presentation, but this is from Caro's book, Landscape by Moses. So all of these roads here are roads that Moses built. He basically ran New York City for 50 years. Jones Beach State Park, he built Jones Beach State Park. He built bridges. He built, you know, roads in New York City. He built center. He just built infrastructure everywhere. Like he built the infrastructure of New York City. And the book by Caro, if you like productive politics, you should definitely read this book because it's absolutely fascinating and it's full of the strategies he used. And I'll give you a few examples, okay? And one of the examples he gives is be ambiguous. Sometimes you just need to be ambiguous about detail that will galvanize laggards, okay? So you get your battles. I'm coming to battles, you know, but you have to pick your battles. Okay? So one thing they say, for example, is he would underestimate the cost of projects. You know, when he'd come up with, oh yeah, this is how much it's going to cost, he'd always underestimate it. He'd always want to get momentum for something, and to get momentum for something, he'd say, you have to underestimate the costs, okay? So you know, that's actually the secret of the University of Chicago. You know, the University of Chicago was funded by John Rockefeller, who basically thought it was a tax dodge to start with rather than an educational enterprise. And he was convinced to pay for this because the people running the University of Chicago at the time essentially endlessly underestimated the cost of how much it was going to be to build like a top university. And they'd come back every year to Rockefeller and ask for another million. We just need another million. Could you give me another million? And after 10 years, Rockefeller said, how much do I need to give you so you go away and I never see you again? That's a famous moment in the history of the University of Chicago. And they said $10 million. Okay, so you may ambiguous about details that will galvanize the laggards. Okay. Often, here's a dirty word, you know, in politics, patronage, okay? But often, you have to think through the distributional consequences of reform, okay? And reforms, if they distribute in the right way, can help to smooth things along. You know, you might want to use the word compensation if you're a public finance economist, you know, but I'm just trying to provoke you here to sort of say patronage, oh, that's a dirty word. Well, maybe, you know, but maybe it moves things along, okay? Here's an example from Nigeria, you know, which is back in the good old days when President Tinubu was running Lagos State in the early 1990s. Here's state, a little bit of Lagos State, the Adeniji Adele Loop at the top. You can see ash everywhere, awful. At the bottom, beautified, okay? So who beautified it? How did they beautify it? They got hired by Governor Tinubu. So he employed thousands and thousands of people to clean up the trash. Okay, so this again is doing something very visceral. You know, it's doing something everyone can see. It's like really smart. That's important. Improving the quality of public spaces and employing also very good politics. Okay, back to Uribe, in Colombia. So here's one thing he did at the weekend. Talk about combining institution building with compensation. Here he is on stage in a place called San Jose de Guaviare in the Eastern Plains in Colombia. This is a municipality where no Colombian president had probably ever been in 200 years. Every Saturday he would go with his ministers to some rural, completely peripheral place in Colombia. They put up a stage, read out questions. So it would take state someplace it had never been before ever. You know, Colombia is sort of half of Colombia is not really governed, you know, by the central. So he was trying to push the state into this periphery. And, you know, think of Eastern Congo, basically what, like, you know, peripheral Colombia is like, the Kivus. So this is like the Kivu. Well, it's like the Kivus, okay? But of course he's also handing favors out. Like people would ask him for stuff and he'd sort of say, yeah, we can build, and say, yeah, we can build that here, can't we? They need a new school. Let's give them a new school. So it was brilliantly combining in this Consejo Comunal, they were called. It was brilliantly combining institution building with compensation. Okay. Another great example, President Kagame. You know, if you look at what goes on in Rwanda, President Kagame brilliantly combines like real institution building and policy implementation with you know, here's my favorite example on the right. I don't know if you can see that. Girinka. So Girinka is one of President Kagame's so-called. It's a fantastic project. It's about redistributing cows, basically giving the government gives cows, and then people are encouraged to give cows to other people. So this is fantastic for nutrition. It's fantastic for poverty. Why cows? You know, an economist would say, shouldn't it be money? Yeah, but if you know something about Rwanda, you know how incredibly important cows are culturally, and the kind of distribution of cows. That was how the whole state worked historically in Rwanda. So it's very important kind of for poverty, and it's very important for many other things in Rwanda, but it also brilliantly fits with the logic of the state. Okay, so you know, all right. So here's a strategy which is always useful. This is useful in academia and anywhere else you go, which is, and Moses was an expert on this. Let me give you an example, which is let people take credit for things they didn't do. Okay, so you have these laggards, people are opposing you. What do? So when Franklin Roosevelt when Moses was doing lots of things in New York City, Franklin Roosevelt was the governor of New York State before he became president, late 1920s, early 1930s. Okay, so I showed you on that map that one of the things that Moses built was the Jones Beach State Park on Long Island. You know, maybe some of you have been there. Okay, so Roosevelt tried to block him and caused all sorts of problems. Okay, so then it's opening. Moses invites Roosevelt to the opening, and he stands up. Roosevelt's there, all kind of grumpy. He stands up and gives all the credit to Roosevelt. Oh, this would never have happened if it had not been for the genius of Franklin Roosevelt. What? You know, as Harry Truman, subsequently president of the United States after Franklin Roosevelt, said, It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Okay, so you buy people by giving them credit for it. Okay, this is a very, very common strategy. Okay, another of Moses' strategies is what he called the oops, sorry technique. Okay, what's the oops, sorry technique? Here's Moses, a quote from Moses. Once you sink that first step, they'll never make you pull it up. Meaning, just get on with something. Just don't ask. Stop doing it. Oh, really? Oh, I should have got your permission first. Sorry. Okay. That's a way of momentum. That's a way of aligning people with the project. With the okay, fine. Okay, he started. Let's just do it. Okay. So that's the oops, sorry technique. Very common used in politics. That's number 8. I know there's a lot. Number 9. Okay. Of course, this is important. When I talked about President Uribe, the sequencing is very important. He knew it takes, his military commanders knew that it was going to take 2 years to make real progress militarily against these guerrilla groups, against the Pesca Milagrosa. You had to raise taxes, you had to hire soldiers, the Americans are going to help, but you have to coordinate with the Americans. There's lots of challenges here. We need new equipment, we need trade. It's going to take 2 years. Wait 2 years, we have to do stuff now. And you need to get that sequence right, okay? You need to get the sequence. You need to get things organized in the right way. Let me state also, I'm a bit of a scholar of this, fantastic examples. Here's Governor here, who was governor of Lagos State after after President Tinubu, great, lots of examples of the sequencing. Okay, so you want political support, you want the Okadas, you want the Okada boys on your side, okay? So in particular, Okada boys are really useful for getting people to the polls, right? Important people, okay? So he even distributed helmets to the Okada boys to secure his 2011 re-election. Well, then he banned them from the center of Lagos. Now you go on Victoria Island, Lagos Island, there's no Okadas, it's all illegal. He did that in the right sequence. Okay, sounds a bit cynical. You have to just, create enemies when you can defeat them, if you like. Now, sometimes it won't work. Here's my most controversial example. I'm going to have like an existential crisis talking about this, which is Mrs. Thatcher. Now, I was never a fan of Mrs. Thatcher, and I don't think I am still, but you have to say it's very hard to achieve things in politics, and she achieved what she set out to achieve. And, some palaver them away. You can't structure reforms so that their interests are not threatened. You can't, doesn't matter what you do to get them on board. You can't, you have to, so, here's on the left, here's Mrs. Thatcher with Arthur Scargill, the former leader of the British Mine Workers Union. And on the right are the police, and the miners fighting, okay? So, let not be turning is the famous expression Mrs. Thatcher used to sort of say, she meant all the power stations in Britain. I grew up in the 1970s. We had power cuts in 1973. We had the 3-week miners basically cut electricity for the country because the electricity production ran on coal, and they cut the coal. So Mrs. Thatcher waited, and they piled up coal, and very strategic. Okay, sometimes you just have to fight for a different society, and I think that's it. There's different ways you could fight. This was a legalistic, it was all sorts of things, but nevertheless sometimes there's disagreement, and you have to just impose what the majority, I guess, want. All right. Which is, where are you going? What's where are you going in society? A bit of utopianism is a very good thing. Dreaming, ambition. Think about, United Arab Emirates. Think about what they achieved in those countries. When they had that dream of creating Dubai, everyone told them in the 1900s, how could you possibly do such a thing? But they didn't care anyway. They just went on and they did it. And that had an enormous mobilizing effect on people, giving them that idea. And I think Atlantic City, it's not going quite as well, as had been hoped. But there's challenges. There's always challenges. But I love the dream, the ambition, I think a bit of utopianism is a good thing. It inspires people you need to inspire people about the potential, about the future, about where you're going and what can you achieve. And I think most of these real success stories, they have that aspect of like getting people to say, oh my gosh, can you imagine if we could do that here and what this place could be like? So I think that's a good thing. All right. So let me shut up now and people can ask some questions. So this is my last slide, just to say, political economy in some sense, from my discussion, you can see that like what political economy has done is it's kind of focused on the laggards, and the presence, the existence of those laggards and the strategies of those laggards, like rent seeking and whatever. And so we've come to see politics as a friction that kind of, we need to sort of like, we can, compensate them. And some of the things I'm talking about, you could sort of say, well, that's pretty common. Yeah, it is, but I'm trying to embed them in a bigger kind of project here. And I want to say, it's a problem here is the vision of a politics-free economics. Economics is never politics-free. Okay? If you recognize that, then you could see that it's not just the problem. It's the lubricant that makes reform happen. Okay. Of course, there's mechanisms here, that I'm not dwelling on. You could say I'm kind of assuming, and this is the elephant in the room in some sense. I'm assuming that the people in charge here, somebody is wanting to push policy reform or institutional change. Okay, and a lot of our work, does the ruling party in Zimbabwe really want to transform the country? They're in a place which is poorer now than it was in 1980 when they took over. Like, think of all that wasted potential, and prosperity. But maybe the problem is they don't want to push change, or they don't have an agenda for change, but they don't see how to do that. If you've read Stefan Durkon's, Gambling for Growth, probably many of you have, this is risky. It's risky. How the heck do we do that? There's no precedent. We don't really know how to do it. So maybe here is a toolkit of kind of possibilities for people like that. So if that's really the constraint, as Stefan thinks, then, maybe these political mechanisms, but they're not as hegemonic as perhaps, some of our work may have suggested. Okay. I think the big thing I want to get you to take away about politics in a much more favorable light and not as a kind of dirty word. And that's the main point today. Okay.
A round of applause to Professor Robinson. Thank you very much. We'll take about 10 or so minutes to get questions and answers. Perhaps if we can get 2 people from this side and maybe another 2 people from this side. I see Abby. 2. Okay, Abby, please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, James. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and giving us a very inspiring and very insightful keynote. I have, I think, one maybe a reflection on the Meiji restoration points that you made. After 1868, the Meiji leaders, after removing Tokugawa, they tried to industrialize and modernize Japan by sending Meiji leaders to America and Western Europe and to go back and industrialize Japan. So my reading through that methodology is that they have transformed Japan into a centralized industrial power. If I interpret what you have said, you said the major restoration didn't really transform Japan. So I would be very happy if you tell us your reflection on this interpretation of history that I have about the major restoration. I felt it has really modernized and industrialized Japan by sending experts to Western Europe. I think a historical comparison, I know you love economic history. We had Emperor Theodorus who reigned in Ethiopia between 1955 to 1968, who decided to import artisans and technicians to Ethiopia. But he failed, mainly I think because they didn't destroy the feudal system there. But I think the system of really getting technology into Ethiopia was completely different from the way Japan did shortly after his days. So I would be happy if you just give us maybe a brief reflection on that.
Thank you, Abby.
Yes.
Let's take maybe about 4 questions, and then you can
Okay,
answer.
all right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Robinson, for that very insightful keynote address. I really enjoyed listening to it. And I just said, many of us in the room are still, even in some elements that you talk about here, you can see some elements which would traditionally be considered quite extractive, you know, like the patronage-based systems, and you still seem to see them as something we need to, as part of the journey, or something we need to still, you know, develop in some sense. So how do you reconcile these sort of insights here and these scenarios and sort of the main argument that you make in your seminal work? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robert Mudida. 2 more. That's here. 1 more, and then 2 from the other side. And then you can respond to those 5.
Thank you for this opportunity. Makora Wilson again. This has been a very insightful presentation, Professor James. But also, when I was listening to you, the aspect of public issues theory came into being, where the aspect of budget maximization and bureaucratic oversupply, as explained by Nescan in 1971, as well as Mueller in 2003. And then it gives me a chance to ask a question: what mechanisms can break the cycle of unproductive politics, such as rent-seeking, budget maximization, bureaucratic oversupply, or corruption, without it triggering political instability? Then the next question, I look at Africa as a case for reference purposes when you're talking about political patronage. In the context whereby political elites, especially in Africa, rely on patronage for survival, is productive politics genuinely attainable without altering the underlying incentive structures? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This side. 1. Please introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. My name is Mulay. I'm from Ethiopia. And thank you for the insightful keynotes. I think some of them are critically important even during, you know, policy process also. Sometimes we may use them. I'm not very clear between, the distinction between some of the strategies looks communication strategies, because the reasons are politics, but the strategies looks communication strategies. So I want to hear, are these strategies we want to tackle the problems, the politics, or, you know, the initial reasons for the problem? Because the reasons are politics, but the approaches are, some of them are political approach, and the others are communication strategies. For instance, the ambiguity, and so on. But I have one question, which I'm not clear, is the strategy 7, which says, let laggards take credit for things they didn't do. I'm afraid this might have a problem, especially in a society which is very diversified. Because when you give the credit to those, who do not deserve, you could have, the other side, which could raise a problem. And actually, we see this type of problem. So, do you think this is a good strategy, really, or should we think apply such type of things, for instance, in homogeneous society, and some of them not to use in a very diversified society? That's the only strategy that I have a doubt whether it really serves or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. One last question, and then he can respond to the 5. Side.
Hi, James. This is Roman Husa. This is a great talk and very fascinating. I was just thinking practically as a politician, if I would like to do reform, how do I proceed? So you have a list of very interesting and inspiring policy. So is there a way to sort of rank the different strategies? And I suppose we'll have to take into account also some constraint or some preferences about the policymaker. For instance, the strategy of avoiding the rich, the people who have power, could be difficult to implement for a policymaker that has a lot of aversion to inequality. So could you a bit elaborate on that and maybe have some example? Thanks.
Thank you very much. 5 questions. One on industrialization by Japanese industrialization by Abi, Professor Mudida, why nations fail, and then there's one that was on budget maximization, and then on a question on laggards, why laggards take credit for things they didn't do, and the last one is on policy reform. So you can respond to those, Professor Robinson.
Yes, great. They're all super questions. I mean, I think, Abby, no, I completely agree with you about the industrial transformation in Japan. My point was as simple, which is when they started that, when Meiji Restoration happened, when these Satsuma and Chosun elites basically took over the state, they restored the emperor. They abolished the shogunate and they restored the emperor, and they restored, and there was this huge emphasis on Japanese culture and traditional religion, and they portrayed this as being restoring like how things should really be done in Japan. Okay, of course there were radical changes, as you were talking about, this Ishikawa mission that was sent overseas to kind of look at other institutions and technology and to try to figure out, what should Japan do? What do we like? What do we not like? Yeah, but the way they set that up for people was, don't worry, this is Japanese. This is totally Japanese, And I think that if you read like what people say, that was very important for kind of getting people to cooperate with this and getting people to feel comfortable with it. So that's that part of it, I think, is what I was trying to emphasize. And that's kind of what allowed, in some sense, all these other things to happen, because it was embedded in this cultural project, which sort of said, don't worry, everything's fine. This is just more Japanese, than anything else, and which is true in a sense, but it was also not true in a very profound sense. Of course, the samurai were then, basically destroyed, the samurai class. So that's I hope that's clear now. I think, in terms of inclusive and extractive, like patronage, I threw this word out, patronage, just because, I see examples where, it's a way of getting things done, and, let me kind of, I'm trying to problematize, the use of that word, I guess. So let me problematize, another word, which I've come to kind of think is really kind of misconceived in the African context, which is patrimonialism. So, every political scientist talks about the African state as patrimonial. What do they mean by that? Well, the African state is kind of penetrated by social networks and kinship groups. And, you know, there was a scandal this week on social media, probably everybody in the audience, you know, Romain, who was showing me that someone was showing me that in Cotonou, that like the president of Tanzania just appointed all her relatives, you know, to the cabinet in Dar es Salaam, you know. So what a scandal, you know, that could never happen in the United States. Anyway, but here's my point. You know, my point is, if you look at the history of the construction of states in Africa, you know, and I don't mean, you know, since 1960, I mean, go back historically, the pre-colonial state. Think about the Rwandan state. I was mentioning Rwanda. What was the traditional Rwandan state called? It was called the Nginya Kingdom. It was named after a clan, a kinship group. And in fact, the way that state was organized historically was around the kinship group and around the clan system in Rwanda. And it expanded and integrated other people by integrating them into the clan, into the kinship group. So that was the whole source of the functionality and organization of the state. And that's true everywhere. It's true of the Asante. It's true of like wherever you go, like traditional Yoruba states in southwest Nigeria. They were based around kinship groups. So that's how things always work in Africa, you know. So why do I call that patrimonialism? That's just using some totally irrelevant kind of set of taxonomies that Max Weber developed to explain European state formation and the dynamics of European state formation. So I think like one should resist kind of importing these concepts, you know, that were developed to explain the dynamics of the Prussian state and use them to talk about the Rwandan state, because I don't think they do a very good job of explaining how the state works in Rwanda, frankly. So I think, I know what you're saying, but like, just let's problematize these things, you know. I guess that's what I'm asking for. I think, you know, rent seeking, you know, all of that stuff, you know, like, here's the way I think about it, you know. You may know the fantastic article by Peter Eke, the great Nigerian sociologist, about the two publics in Africa. Okay, there's two publics. There's the moral, you know, public of the village, of the local society, of the traditional society. And then there's the alien institution called the national state, you know, which was created by the colonial powers. Okay, no African created that thing. Colonial powers created it, you know. And Eke's view was the whole problem in post-colonial Africa is, you know, solving that social contracting problem. You know, if you go back to Nyerere, I was talking about Julius Nyerere, he writes extensively about this. You know, he knew exactly what the problem was. And so did Seretse Khama, by the way, you know. And so that problem has created what you're describing. It's created, you know, patronage politics in the national state. It's created, you know, Eke called it like an amoral zone, you know. In Igbo, if you translate, you know, from Igbo, the literal translation of like a civil service position, you know, in the government is white man's job. You take the Igbo and you translate that into English, it's like white man's job. Okay, so this is an alien institution, the state in Abuja. So that's created rent seeking. It's created failures of accountability and representation, and that's a political problem that Africans have to solve, you know. But how are you going to solve it? Through politics. You're going to solve it. That's the political problem, okay? So that's another place where you need to think productively about politics, okay? There's a social contracting problem there. You know, it's harder to solve than John Locke or Thomas Hobbes lets on. But again, that's about productive politics, I think. So I'm not disagreeing with you that there's rent seeking and all of that there. But to get rid of that, you have to reform the social contract in Africa, and I think we should go back to thinking about that, you know, or we should think more about it. Communication strategy, yeah, but communications is a huge part of politics. I mean, absolutely. You know, you need people to cooperate you. What's the biggest problem with policy implementation? Think about like tax avoidance. What is tax avoidance about? It's about people not thinking that the state is legitimate, or not thinking that if they pay taxes, that money is really going to be used for providing public goods. And that is a communication strategy. You've got to convince people that something is happening and you're doing something, and their money really is going to be used for something collectively beneficial. Okay, so I think communication is a huge part of politics. And I think, you know, give credit I have many examples of that. Maybe it doesn't always work. I don't know. I haven't really thought about what you're asking. Does this work in diverse societies? I mean, that's a great question. Maybe there's a lot of different people and you can't give them all credit, right? And so that I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest with you. But this is a sort of, it's a list of kind of options, and some of these things may work or they may not work. And like think about the South Africa case. In some sense, like the transition in South Africa, this strategy of pretending nothing has changed, you couldn't use that. That was like off the table in South Africa. Of course you couldn't do that in South Africa. You have to give Africans the hope that finally, something has changed. So that strategy was never on the table for Mandela. In some sense, I think, in Britain with the Glorious Revolution, it was on the table, but they decided, no, we're going to do it this other way. Okay, so that's, there's some of the options are applicable and not, and I don't know. You're raising a good issue, but I haven't really thought through it, and I can, back, to Romain's question right at the end there, I don't know how there's a lot of things that you need to think about that I didn't even talk about. Like what I see, based on my personal experience also, is that one of the most difficult things in politics, but maybe the most important thing, is like prioritize. So I've been doing this work on Korean industrialization, and in the summer I was in Korea in August, and I was interviewing these guys who worked for President Park in the 1970s, in the Ministry, the Economic Planning Board and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And one gentleman, he told me it was like fascinating. So his job every day was he'd get to work in the morning and he'd have to telephone 23 custom houses. So there were 23 customs houses in South Korea. And he had to ask every single day, including at weekends, he had to ask, how much did you export yesterday, the day before? Okay, now you're thinking, that's ridiculous. Like, why would it matter? No. By noon, President Park had to have a report on his desk of how much did each customs post export yesterday. And so I asked him, I said, like, well, what happens if it was a good export day? He said, oh yeah, we got really excited. We had this song. We used to sing the export song. I asked him, could he sing the export song? And he was either too embarrassed or he'd forgotten the words, And then I said, well, what happened if it was a bad export day? He said, oh, that was terrible. President Park would call me up and he'd say, call up Samsung, call up Hyundai, call up Daewoo, tell them what the heck is going on and why they didn't export anything. And then I'd have to call up Samsung, I'd have to call up, and I'd have to come back by the end of the day, President Park, with a report explaining why exports have been so bad. Okay. Now, as an economist, you might think, well, that's crazy. Like, why is he just so obsessed with one thing? But he was completely obsessed and with that one thing, just total and utter prioritization. And of course, if you think about that from a perspective of economic theory, that had all sorts of linkages, right? Forcing people to really focus on that. There was a meeting every month, the Export Promotion Guarantee meeting. Every month, President Park would show up. He would chair that meeting. I think he missed 2 meetings in 15 years. He would show up and all the CEOs of all the companies had to show up at that meeting for a whole day, and President Park would negotiate with them, heck to them, tell them whatever. Okay, so that laser sharp focus, that prioritization, that is incredibly difficult to do in politics, but it's absolutely essential for getting anything done. And I didn't even talk about that. But what do you prioritize? I think this idea of there's all these linkages from different things, and that is very important for prioritizing. I think, I could talk about many other examples like that. So I think, yeah, there's lots of trade-offs, like you're saying. There's trade-offs. I mean, you care about inequality, you're going to have to do things in different ways, and different contexts and different societies, are going to be, the context is going to be important in ways that I couldn't really go into. I just give you that South African example of context to show, well, that means that only one type of strategy is going to work in South. You can't do the Glorious Revolution strategy in 1994 in South Africa. You have to show people that something different is happening. But okay, fine. So, and there's other issues I haven't talked about. So, and there's trade-offs as you're suggesting. But yeah, there's lots to discuss.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson. A round of applause to Professor Robinson. Unfortunately, we cannot take more questions because we have overshot the scheduled time, and we have another session that is coming up immediately after this. So thank you very much, Professor Robinson. His research centers on political economy, comparative politics and economics, as well as political development. He's particularly interested in the relationship between political power, institutions, and prosperity. Please, if you find time, grab some of the books that he has co-authored by Daron Mangulu. Some of the bestsellers, indeed, like The Wealth of Nations that Professor Muda talked about, why nations fail, the origins of power, prosperity, and poverty, published in 2012, and Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy in 2005. So let's transition to the next session, which we are going to have a book launch, and I would like to invite Dr. Ross Ngugi and Jared Osoro to please come in front so that I'd also like to invite